Hello everybody. It's great to see a lot of people interested in digital governance and civic technology. We are here to discuss those matters. I happen to serve as moderator today. I'm Martin Kaevats, I'm from Estonia, work as the National Digital Advisor of Estonia and responsible for information society and innovation for the Estonian government. But I think one of the reasons I was also invited here is that I have a background in civic technology and participatory democracy. So roughly 10 years ago I was an activist working on the streets of Tallinn, but now I have basically jumped the wall and working for the government. So I have basically, in a way, angles to look both sides. But to start off, I would like to start off with a small provocation, perhaps. This morning there was a keynote by Jeffrey Sachs talking about trust. And I would like argue, or at least in the interest of making this session a bit more interesting, I would argue that he failed to see the actual point of what the internet is doing to trust. Because he was talking a lot towards like reinventing trust towards the institutions. Yes, that's true. But I like the way Rachel Botsman in her last book, Who Do You Trust, actually tries to describe. And one of those ideas is, which I can relate to, also personally and also from the Estonian government side, is that there is actually new forms of trust formed by internet. So one of those examples is like, after the industrialization, we needed to create the institutions, centralized institutions, to be the institutions of trust, governments and banks and all of those things. But now we are actually seeing new forms of trust, which Rachel Botsman calls distributed trust. There are lots of examples of these. The most simple ones is like Airbnb and platform type, and some of them are good and some of them not so good, but still, I would argue that internet has made trust different fundamentally. And I think civic technology, as there are parallel sessions about legal systems and the idea of reinventing the state, then I would still argue that civic technology is one of the fundamental things that actually tries to build and rebuild this trust. And it's not about completely abolishing institutions. No, it's about creating a new hybrid model, which a lot of it is related to peer-to-peer and this kind of idea of distributed trust. In the Estonian government model, for example, I think we are not there yet, of course, but we are more or less on the way to provide this type of distributed trust at scale. This is something that we are moving towards. We are in the beginning of this road, but hopefully there is a lot of examples globally. But one of the things that I feel as a background of an activist is that these kind of ideas and models have not yet been adopted by the mainstream governments. So the actual structural changes that this technology has, these examples are yet smaller, and I think they need to grow bigger, and actually to make this fundamental change in the government, more time is needed, because this is again the culture and the mindset change. But without further ado, there is a very nice panel, lots of interesting examples and people looking at the very, very broad idea of how social media and open data works to more concrete examples, how we actually can change the structures. So the structure of today is like everybody has a 10-minute talk, and then we have a discussion, try to have a very open debate together with the audience. So we'll start it off with Helen. So Helen Margetts is the program director for public policy at the Alan Turing Institute. And I think she would be better at introducing herself, but please, Helen, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a great honour to be here. I speak from the perspective of somebody as an academic who has been researching the relationship between government and technology for a very long time. In fact, I wrote my PhD about what is now called digital government in Britain and America back in the 1990s, when that was quite a sad and lonely thing to do, because literally nobody else was interested in that topic. Now quite a lot of people are interested in that topic, but I think it's fair to say that many governments across the world, perhaps in this country rather less, but certainly in my own country and many of the countries of Europe and the Americas, struggle with technology, struggle to make the most of technology, struggle to use technology to improve the relationships between citizens and governments. And at the programme I'm directing at the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science, we are trying to think about how the newest version of technologies could kind of optimize the relationship between citizens and governments, do something to improve that relationship rather than being something to struggle with. But I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about a technology, social media platforms, that is actually not really used by government, is used much more extensively by citizens, and used mostly by citizens to do more interesting things than interacting with government, like shopping or listening to music and so on. But it is having, the citizens' use of social media is having very profound implications for government, as Martin has suggested. So I think it's worth thinking a little bit about that. Oh, it is over there. So I'm going to show you a tiny bit of data. That data comes from research we carried out for this book I wrote with colleagues of at Oxford called Political Turbulence, where we tried to understand the relationship between social media and any activity undertaken by citizens in pursuit of public goods. That is collective action, political participation, mobilization, civic engagement. Any of those words that mean that citizens are kind of acting on behalf of the common good, or acting collectively. We wanted to try and understand that. And I guess the kind of seed of the key argument of that book is this: that what's new about social media, and we've heard quite a lot about social media in the last couple of days, most of it quite bad and derogatory about how social media is kind of ruining our social health and monopolizing the economy and making fools out of governments and so on. But just thinking positively just for a moment, one thing that social media do is they allow very small acts of political participation, liking something, following a political figure, sharing something, viewing something, even reading one of Donald Trump's tweets. All of those things are, to a very small extent, an actual act of political participation. And what's interesting about that is it kind of expands. I'm a political scientist. This expands the ladder of political participation that we habitually understand participation by. It extends it at the lower end. It makes it possible to do a very little bit of politics, which didn't used to be possible. Traditional political science theories show a kind of activist elite who are putting a lot of time into politics, somewhat divorced from more kind of normal people who maybe vote in elections and don't do very much else. I think that's positive. I think it's drawing people into politics, particularly young people who political scientists like me have been bemoaning for years and not interested in politics. And every day we're hearing about more and more things that young people particularly are doing in terms of political mobilization. I should point out that that is rather an unpopular idea, particularly in Britain, where I come from, where as in many countries, I think there's a culture of kind of politics as pain. It doesn't really count as politics unless it's painful. You go to a long meeting, you knock on doors, you tramp the streets, you go to a demonstration, you have to do something kind of unpleasant for it to count properly as politics. And I think what's important here is just to reconsider that politics as pain principle and think about what happens when you undertake a tiny act of participation. That is, that even if you just click like on something related to a policy issue or some kind of civic issue, that sends a tiny signal to the rest of the people who see that, because some number will increase, some number indicating the support or the viability of that particular issue. I've shown at the bottom of this page. That's from Facebook. There's a lot of angry faces actually on this one because it's a Facebook post relating to something that Donald Trump has done. But you can see there 593 comments, 2,800 reactions. Every time somebody does something, those numbers go up by a tiny bit, which adds a little signal of viability to whatever that issue is. And that's important. Why is it important? Because, of course, that it can scale up to something really big. A wave of support for some unlikely political figure, public revulsion perhaps at some kind of incident, as I think there has been in Korea this week. It could be anything, but we have seen over again. I've shown some images here, but it could be any country in the world. I could show you some mass mobilization which has originated in the scaling up of little tiny acts of participation on social media. You've got demonstrations in Brazil against widespread poverty and rising costs. You've got the Me Too movement. You've got Podemos, the social movement that now is an established force in Spanish politics and has been an extremely disruptive, kind of had very disruptive effects on the Spanish political system. Here, the bottom photograph shows something which is not a mobilization at all. It's just a photograph of a German football stadium where some people are holding up a banner. But just by sharing that photograph, hundreds of thousands of people indicated to refugees wherever they might be in the world, and evidence shows that refugees prioritize a mobile phone above anything when they flee a war-torn country, that perhaps they were more welcome here than other countries. And I think that's the point really, that it means that somebody with no more resources than a mobile phone can indeed in some way take some tiny measure of control over both their individual and collective well-being, and that's important. I should point out quickly here that, of course, usually that doesn't happen. We see the ones that succeed. We see the photographs that reached a lot of people. Most tweets are never retweeted. Most Facebook posts are never shared. Most photographs go nowhere. And most mobilizations fizzle out within hours. This here is all the, this little graph here shows all the petitions to the UK government over a period of several years. We have that complete data sets for the UK and the US, which basically shows that the yellow ones are the ones that succeeded in getting 100,000 signatures necessary for a parliamentary debate, and all the rest of them, all the dark red ones, 99.9% of them absolutely, completely failed. Most mobilizations failed. But the ones that succeed do actually make a difference. They raise the profile of an issue, they affect policy change. Anyone was there in the Grand Ballroom this morning will have heard the president of the Korean Institute of Public Administration talking about the Blue House petitions platform here and how that has affected policy change. So a very few of these kind of social media initiated mobilizations or kind of waves of support succeed. Most of them fail. That's having all sorts of implications for governmental systems everywhere. It's a very disruptive influence. We don't know much about the difference between the ones that succeed and the ones that fail. It's really, really hard to work out why some succeed and one fail. It seems to be introducing an element of randomness into political systems, which is very disturbing for governments. We do know that the ones that are successful develop really fast. They do it in a matter of hours. These are the ones that got more than 10,000. And that pattern is true over and over again right across social media. These are the mobilizations against policing in the US. That shows both Twitter and Facebook, this same pattern going up very quickly in the first few days or hours. That's a big challenge for governments right across the world, because this sort of civic engagement, this sort of mobilization can happen without institutions, without organization. It's a case of people acting first and identifying later, if at all. That's why the British political system at the moment is in complete chaos, because it's completely defined by this one act of whether people voted to leave the European Union or voted to stay in the European Union, rather than party identification or allegiance. That's leading to the kind of volatility that I've talked about briefly here. And it's challenging institutions of all kinds. Very unlikely that the British political parties will ever recover from this. Will the US political parties recover from the phenomena that created Trump? And there's an image of the Spanish government, symptomatic of how the Spanish government is struggling with the Catalan movement in Barcelona. So, just to end, I would like to suggest that there's a number of sort of questions here that governments, or a number of challenges to government, by these new forms of political, well, not so new anymore, but these kind of rapidly developing forms of political participation and civic engagement. I would like to suggest that governments should kind of value this rather than confront it, which is the most common reaction of governments. Value tiny acts of participation. Think of the signals that they show to governments about how people are experiencing public services or public policies, for example. We did a little bit of work for the UK Department of Work and Pensions on how social media data might tell them about how people were thinking about universal credit, the profound reform to our benefit system that's going on at the moment. Unfortunately, they didn't turn that into a much bigger study, but if they had, it might have shown them how kind of disastrously that policy was actually playing out in practice. It's a question of understanding that a lot of this is social innovation as much as technical innovation. The need to kind of build platforms where people are, rather than expecting people to come to government. We had a nice example, perhaps, of that in the main ballroom earlier. People are expected to sort of go to some special place to respond to what everyone's saying, but could they use Twitter instead? Would that actually be a better way of reaching more people to comment, for example, to complain, or whatever people might be doing to government? So I think there is a new willingness to engage, and that governments ought to be doing more to kind of harness that and thinking about how to build services, to build policy kind of around the kind of information that new forms of engagement are providing them. But I'm sure we're going to hear more about that from the other speakers, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. A lot of interesting thoughts, and actually I have lots of questions, but I will skip them for later because I think this whole package is important to try to look at it as a whole thing. So next off, we got Latin America. Otherwise, we have a very European-based panel. But now we got Natalia. Basically, as I heard, she used to be a civil servant and now jumped the wall and is a civil society activist and working on open data. But floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. As Martin said, I'm Natalia Garfi. I'm from Argentina. I work for the Open Data Charter, which is a global organization, but I'm part of the open data community of Latin America, a very strong one, and which I'm going to talk about. So what is the Open Data Charter? The Open Data Charter has the goal of embedding open data as a central ingredient to achieve better solutions in pressing most pressing policies challenges of our time. We work with governments and other organizations in trying to develop added public value in opening up data that governments create. We were born in 2015 and out of a global conversation between international organizations, governments, civil society. We held public consultations online in 3 languages. And out of that global conversation came 6 principles, which are the principles that rule our work and open data. These are the 6 principles that we work on, which are pretty much self-explained, except for the first one, which is rather controversial for governments, which is that open data should be something that they do by default. So all the data that government actually creates, except for personal data, security, national security data, and certain other types of data that are prohibited by law, should actually be open because people actually own that data. As public servants, I used to be a public servant for 10 years, and I've been in civil society organizations since May. So I might talk of we as a public servant. But as a public servant, I used to be a creator of data, and I was paid with public money, so the data belongs to the people, not to the government. And then, of course, for data to be actually usable for creating new public value, it should be timely and comprehensive. It should be accessible and usable. It should be comparable and interoperable. And we want to improve governance and citizen engagement throughout opening up government data and try to build on inclusive development and create new innovation. But I'm used to talking in open data and open government conferences, so I'm not sure everybody here actually knows what open data is. So if you don't know what open data is, you are in the right place, because I'm going to do a short explanation about what open data is. Who in the place actually knows what open data is and when I'm talking about open data? I've been working on this for 6 years, so it's okay to raise your hands. For me, it's 24/7. But okay, so I didn't create this chart. This was Tim Berners-Lee, and this is what we used to explain for governments and civil society organizations, pretty much everybody, what open data is. Please do raise your hands if you've ever tried to do a copy paste from a PDF file into a Word one, and then spend like 2 hours trying to figure out how to make it readable. Okay, so that explains the non-reusable side of PDF. So we just have 1 star. It is not a good way of opening up data. It doesn't allow you to reuse the data within that document. You can actually use PDF in order to for a transparency policy. It's better to have a PDF out there than not have the information whatsoever. But if you want to move forward in an open data policy, you need not to publish in PDF. So we have 1 star. Let's move into 2 stars. There you have an Excel sheet. What's the difference with the PDF? You can actually extract the data out of the Excel sheet and do your own creations with that. You can do visualizations, you can do your own analysis, but why do we only have 2 stars? You actually have to buy a program in order to open that file. And I'm doing a super like quick explanation of what open data is, but you're getting the grips, aren't you? Then we have 3 stars, CVS. In my computer, where I use actually Excel, a CVS will actually open in the Excel sheet. But if I wanted to, I could use OpenOffice, and actually without spending any money, I could actually use that data and reuse it in whatever way I want. So moving forward, you will see different levels of interoperability of those data sets, the ability of reusing those data sets. I'm not going to move forward into more stars. Most governments actually open up data in 3 stars, if they do, or 2 stars. This all has to be accompanied with open licenses. Of course, government has to say which are the licenses that allow the reuse and which ways you can actually reuse this data that they are opening up. But this is a quick explanation, super short explanation, and we can talk about open data after this panel a lot. This is a quick explanation on what I'm talking about when we talk about open data. There's a lot of governmental data out there that is not actually open. It is published in websites, but they don't allow the reuse of those data sets. What do we do from the Charter in order to work and help out governments to open up data, aside from the principles which actually create a framework for open data policies over the globe? We work on thematic priorities addressing key problems that can actually be worked on with public policies, with collaboration with civil society organizations. So we've created alongside with other organizations, these open up guides. So we have a list of key data sets that could actually be opened in order to report, for example, agriculture to the SDGs. We could actually work on climate change. We also have created an open up guide on climate change open data. And we gather all the examples and all the standards that already exist out there and just work together into this document that explains to government how to open up that data. And we also are working in the whole Americas. It's actually an inter-American program on open data for anti-corruption. So which are the key data sets that should be open in order for data to allow a better fight against corruption, which is actually a massive problem, and collaboration between governments is really needed because the corruption systems actually work through the governmental limits. And I wanted to let you know a little bit about the open data community in Latin America, because we are actually an example in something that we are proud of. It's been 10 years of open data, almost 10 years. We've decided that this is the 10th year. And so in Argentina this year, the International Open Data Conference was held, but it was the 6th time that AbreLatam and Condatos was held. What is AbreLatam and what is Condatos? AbreLatam is actually an unconference organized by civic organizations throughout the region, and they gathered and share experiences and share platforms and shares do's and don'ts, and it's been 6 years of that. The first AbreLatam was held in Uruguay, and I was a public official. I was the only public official that actually went to AbreLatam because government was seen as an enemy, so they weren't allowed. And I just went in. But then, as of last year, actually, there are governmental officials participating in AbreLatam and collaborating with civil society organizations in trying to figure out how to make the most and how to create public value out of the collaboration between civil society organizations and governments and open data. Condatos is the governmental conference that is held 6 years also, that is held just after AbreLatam. And that's where governments actually gathered without talking with civil society organizations. And as of last year, there's a mixture also in Condatos. So civil society organizations also go to Condatos. And collaboration is part of trust, and this has been a learning experience for the whole Latin American region in how to create and build that trust in order to be able to do things like this. This is an example on how civic tech and open data can actually help out make a better public policy. This is a project from Uruguay. It was organized, it's actually running still. It was organized by DATA, which is a civic organization in Uruguay, and the Health Ministry of Uruguay. The Health Ministry actually worked to open up the data of the health system and the health private companies that worked in Uruguay. And then they collaborated with Data in order to create a platform that is called A Tu Servicio, which would be translated in your service, where citizens can actually go in and upload their profile, like a single woman, certain age, I don't have kids, I do have kids, whatever profile you have. And the platform will let you know which is the best health system option that you could take for yourself. Like, should I actually hire a private health security system? Should I just go to the public hospital? So it's helping citizens take informed decisions out of the open data that government did. If you see the data set, it's a harsh piece of data. But throughout this collaboration with this organization, they created a platform that actually allows citizens to better understand and better make choices for their health and their family's health, which is great. They've earned a zillion prizes with this project because it's a perfect example on what open data can actually do to add value to public problems. Health is a major issue for everybody. And so now Uruguayan citizens can take better decisions with this platform that they co-created together. But there's a zillion of examples. And so there's this platform that is called Civic Stack, where civil society organizations actually upload the code of different platforms that they've created that use open data that has been opened by government in order to develop a zillion different projects. Democracy OS, the first one out there, is an online platform for civic conversation, civic engagement, to try to co-create projects of law. And it's open code. Everything in Civic Stack is open coded, so you can actually reuse it. Acá no hay luz, which would mean we don't have light here, is an open platform to let the government know where there's a power cut because the government wasn't organized enough. So they created this platform. You can actually download the code and use it. Explica la ley, which would be explain the law. It's a platform that explains in plain language what a project of a certain law means to plain citizens, and then they can actually participate in that. Caminos de la Villa, it's a platform that allows you to check out, and then there will be a presentation on this, but allows you actually to understand where slums are in different countries, especially around big cities in Latin America, because there are certain places where government is not capable of going and actually mapping what is going on in these slums. So within a collaboration between government and civil society organizations that already worked there, they created this platform and uploaded the information of the families that lived there and actually mapped the streets of the slums that weren't not even in Google Maps. So this is it. These are just a bunch of examples from Latin America, and I'll be up for questions in a bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Lots of energy you got there. In Estonia, we have like roughly 700 delegations to investigate e-governance, and one of the main problems is actually very similar to yours. Mostly when governments start working on e-governments, they tend to put out PDFs. So basically, everybody, we need to understand, BDFs are not e-governance or open data, so same. So next up, we have Irina. Basically, as found out yesterday, the sharpest tool in the shed. She's a board member of the Open Knowledge International, but probably you can introduce yourself as well.
I can introduce myself. Is this working? Can people hear me? Yes. Hello. Wonderful. So today I'll be talking a bit about some of the challenges that I think civic tech and governments face today in this topic. So to tell you a little tiny bit more about me, my name is Irina Bolishevsky. I'm the director of redecentralized.org, which is currently a non-profit organization. I'm on the board of Open Knowledge International, which is a non-profit that advocates for open data and kind of open approaches towards information, open access within science, kind of data literacy, journalistic activities, and maintains the open definition about what kind of counts as open. And I also, right now, kind of work as a consultant, and I advise, for example, organizations like the ODI on digital identity or data trusts. So, yeah, I really want to kind of start with some bad news. Just, you know, I was reading the kind of description of this session, and I thought, I'm not really sure I agree with any of this at all. I really think, you know, we're in a bit of a crisis. If we think about civic technology and civil institutions, they are largely dependent on, you know, wealthy philanthropists and individual donations. I mean, we as a society are still incredibly profit-driven, and we do not tax, you know, like our taxes do not pay for like the majority of civic activity. We do not have huge replacements for the kind of rituals that used to exist around worship and communities. You know, now that we live in a kind of in a society that has you know, become more global, people are moving around, more atomized, we don't have a replacement for a lot of the ways that people learn civic literacy and what it means to kind of have agency and a way to influence the, you know, the communities that we live in politics. And generally, we actually don't have time. Like with technology and with everything else, people do not have the time to particularly get involved and make a difference. And a lot of the ways in which we try and make a difference, you know, yes, we retweet and maybe we sign a petition, aren't very meaningful. And as you saw from Helen's talk, don't often work. So I kind of want to talk about a few things that I've experienced in my career, and I'll probably, given time, focus mostly on the last point, which is I think technology is really eroding away at the fabric of society, and discuss how we might then tackle this. So firstly, I want to kind of stop at open data. I've spent like maybe about 7 years in open data. So I've spent about over 12 years in technology, and the last 7 years I helped drive some of the open data movement forward. I built an organization that, a project that allows governments to publish open data on their websites, CCAN. And I worked with many governments internationally. I worked with the US government, the UK government, the European Commission, and, you know, the project that I developed was incredibly successful, but what it actually did was it allowed governments to go through the motions of doing something, having a platform, publishing some open data, and actually almost kind of feel like, hey, their job is done. And I think one of the things that's really important is open is a tactic. It is not the end goal. You know, why do we care about open data? We might care about open data because it allows us to hold governments and companies to account. But in order for accountability to be realized, you need a lot more than just some open data. You need the right data to be open in an accessible format with civic, you know, with a thriving civic sector that can do something about it, with independent investigative journalists writing about it, and people actually engaging. If you're using open data to drive the economy, wonderful. Again, there's strings to that attached with it. You need the conditions for that open data to make a difference. You need data to be reliable, not kind of at the end of a process. So I think there's a huge more that needs to be done. But at the same time, governments are not necessarily equipped to do this yet. Governments are quite slow, and they are kind of desperately in need of reform. So I'm a huge believer in governments and politics. I think, as somebody wrote, politics is the negotiation of difference without violence. And I think it's a really wonderful thing. I think it's wonderful that we have politics, wonderful that we have governments. I'm really glad we're not just shooting the people that disagree with us as a way to kind of get things to happen. But at the same time, everything takes a long time, and governments often get very excited about new technologies like blockchain without focusing on fundamentals like proper digital infrastructure and data infrastructure, so that they can actually understand what's going on and assess policies with outcomes. We really need to be thinking more about defining the problems well. We need to be doing user research. We need to be looking at impact. As part of my work, I worked a lot with the European Commission as well, who I think correctly identified that there were areas that they really needed to fund, and it was incredibly valuable. But at the same time, much of the funding would go into building a new massive platform instead of actually identifying organizations and communities that are already working on that problem, giving them much more money to actually finish that work, given that they're already working on, motivated to understand it, and then spend 80% of the funding on actual adoption, coalition building, and getting that thing to succeed. I mean, there's a real misconception. And it concerns me when ministers are looking at using blockchain and AI to solve problems, when, having worked, I recently spent a year inside Cabinet Office within GDS, building up their personal data infrastructure program. And I spend a lot of time within government departments, and like the state of government technical processes are really immature. And we need to tackle these fundamentals, and we need to tackle the way kind of we can have meaningful democratic engagement between people and government at a more granular level than once every 4 years, where you just sort of vote for a party. There's a huge amount that still needs to be done there. So, which brings me to like my last kind of terrible news, which is technology. I think technology is actually both really positive and negative. Its ability to scale is shocking and is really a game changer. I mean, I can sell an operating system to every single person on the planet in a way that I simply won't be able to sell them a car. I mean, like, it's just, my ability to sell every single person on the planet cars is really limited in lots of ways, whilst my ability to sell software is not. And but at the same time, I think it's incredibly powerful when it comes to distributing power and being a tool for change. So I really quickly, God, the time went. I want to talk about surveillance capitalism, digital monopolies, and trust. And I think these are the kind of major, some of the major issues of our time when it comes to digital governance and civic technology. Surveillance capitalism, I don't know if you know the term, is really about how our data is used to sell our attention and manipulate us. If we take Facebook as an example, they are literally spending billions in figuring out how to keep people on Facebook for longer so that they can make more money. Since that's really that's what the product's about. We're living in an age where this is kind of commonplace and accepted, and part of our everyday day-to-day experience, which is our kind of neuroses or paranoias are kind of exploited for profit, and we kind of seem to just put up with that. Monopolies are also a huge issue. If you look at Amazon, the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos, is the wealthiest man on the planet right now, and Amazon has wiped out hundreds of thousands of different businesses. And at this point in time, it's really hard to compete with Amazon. You're much better off joining an Amazon marketplace, simply because they are cheaper, and to sort of compete with the supply chain is much, much harder. Digital monopolies lead to a whole series of things, which is they mean that we don't really have meaningful choice anymore. You know, if you opt out of Facebook, you can't actually go use something else. Facebook owns your social graph, and it won't let you talk to your friends on Facebook without having a Facebook account, which technically speaking is really not inevitable or necessary. And opting out of Facebook has consequences. It leads to social isolation to some extent because everybody's on Facebook and network effects are a thing. So monopolies really kind of, they shift that power balance to power within companies instead of individuals. And the last thing I think that is at issue, and this is something that Martin talked about, is really trust. Everyone, which is a think tank in the UK, did some research around trust in technology, and I think only 12% said technology's positive for society, and about 89% wanted better terms and conditions, greater control, and greater transparency of what happens to their data. There's a huge amount of anxiety around digital technology, and yet this is something that we aren't really tackling. Often the narrative in the spaces that I'm in is that it's really the onus is on the individual to figure out how to use technology safely. I think this is really kind of absurd. Technology is so fundamental to our lives. Like, we use it to work, we use it to communicate, we use it to like make friends, plan events, go places, and yet it's up to me to kind of read terms and conditions and try and make sure that the details that I put in an app aren't going to be misused or exploited. I'm not going to be, the kind of the victim of identity fraud. Whilst at the same time, we do have really good processes around other things. Like, so in many Western countries, tap water is safe to drink. I don't go into every house with my own water testing kit. It's not up to me to check that the water is safe to drink. There are processes, and we pay for quality water as a society. In the same way, buildings, you have to have an accreditation to ultimately build a building or a bridge. There's a process. Anyone can build technology. Anyone is allowed to ask for your personal details. Anyone can ask for your address, for your date of birth, for your credit card details, and they can store them in unsecured databases. And this is a genuine concern. So I'm completely out of time, so I'm going to be really quick. So one of the things that I think is an antidote to this is looking at decentralization. And Redecentralize is an independent institution that is curious about how do we distribute power through decentralized technologies, and in what way peer-to-peer or cryptocurrency or other decentralized technologies can build some of that kind of infrastructure and help provide systemic incentives for difference. And this is where it really connects to the topic of this conference. I think what we need in technology is we need to be looking at bringing back values such as autonomy. How do individuals have greater control over what happens to them? They have more agency, how they work, and especially act online. How do we have greater diversity, more choice, but also a less monotonous internet? Maybe not everybody likes the way that Google works, and actually we need technology and solutions that have fundamentally different ways of empowering their users. And we also need privacy for many reasons for well-being. So Redecentralize is working on a whole set of interventions to make this possible, which I can talk about later. And the thing that I really care about is bringing in a digital world that serves the needs of people above companies. So if this is something that you're interested in to partner or support, please come and talk to me about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, don't worry, we have time. Because it's also interesting case study. Actually, also some reflection from the Estonian side. You basically mentioned open data as tactics. It's not the goal in its own right. I think, like in Estonia, lots of like countries come to visit and politicians, and we consult other countries as well. But I think the main problem again is that although people acknowledge that they tell that digitalization is a tool, they actually don't act by it. So they take like open data as a goal. They take digitalization as something that a fundamental goal we want to go to. And this is the mistake they make because this is something that they cannot ever achieve. And this is the thing, I think, why politicians need to be more humble towards technology. But last but not least, we got Mark coming up. He's the guy who is running My Society. So a lot of good examples from the UK today. So stage is all yours.
Afternoon, everyone. It's really fantastic to be here at the OECD Forum in Korea especially, and it's a great honour to be representing My Society. I joined My Society 3.5 years ago, and My Society in many ways is the original civic tech organisation. My esteemed predecessor, Tom Steinberg, actually coined the term civic technology. That is up to some debate, but you can take it up with Tom, not with me, I might add. But we've been, My Society as an organisation has been around for 15 years. And what I'm going to talk about today is basically how we have been responding and how we have had to change as the demands on participation have changed, and how the technology has changed, and people's raised expectations about what is possible. So we've, as we've been around for a relatively long time, we've had to kind of adapt recently. So I'm going to talk about that particular journey. I'm going to show a couple of case studies as well, just about some examples, and hopefully try and pick up and build up on some of the issues that have been raised and how we're trying to actually deal with some of them in our own practice. So civic technology, from my perspective and from our perspective, is distinct from government tech in as much as we represent the needs and desires of the citizen. So that isn't necessarily what government wants, it's about what citizens want of their government. And so to that end, we help people be active citizens, because we believe that secure and fair democracies need engaged and informed citizens, especially in the current situation, the kind of current political situation, the rise of populism and so on. People are making decisions ill-informed. The only time they have the opportunity, has been touched upon already, to actually exercise any democratic participation is around elections, or God help us, around referendum. See how that went in the UK. And so what we do is we help people be active citizens. We provide technology, research, data used by individuals, journalists, civil society in over 40 countries around the world. So whilst we are a UK-based organisation, we have versions of our services running all around the world. And we're able to do that because we have really fantastic partners in each country. So we're not naive enough to think that we can run a parliamentary monitoring service in South Africa. We work with a parliamentary monitoring group in South Africa. We provide the technology and support, and they actually run the service day to day. And we've repeated that model in many ways. But the reason I want to focus on the citizen, and this is a quote from a wonderful organisation called the New Citizenship Project. The actual act of thinking of yourself as a citizen means you're more likely to participate, to volunteer, to come together, to make society stronger and more effective. So the actual act of thinking of yourself as a citizen changes the whole dynamic. So, and this is distinct from moving on from thinking of ourselves only as consumers, or previous thinking of ourselves as subjects of royalty or so on. So the way we address this, we have a number. You may be familiar with some of our services, things that Fix My Street, theyworkforyou.com, which monitors the work of Parliament, and whatdotheyknow.com, which I'm going to talk about briefly. And so these are digital services that allow people to make demands of government, to understand where power lies, and to kind of have influence over that power. But the really critical thing at the moment is, I was really, well, I guess yesterday I was kind of a little bit disappointed that the general consensus that I felt from the main stage was that, well, GDP didn't work, so now we do GDP plus, and we add some wellness and happiness metrics on, and things will be okay. And your things are not okay at the moment. Regardless of how much progress we're making in reducing inequality and reducing poverty and so on, all that progress could so easily be overwhelmed in the next 10 or 15 years by climate crisis and rise of populism and so on. And the fact that it's easy, you probably heard the phrase, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But it's easier to imagine the end of the world rather than giving up fossil fuels or transforming our economies in the way that we need to actually address some of these problems. So I'm hugely optimistic that we can do this, but it's going to take such a massive transformation from where we are today that this is a massive task, and we cannot do it just with expectations of our leadership doing it on our behalf. We have to participate, especially at the local level. We need to come together and organise, and community groups and so on, because just at the time we need the best possible leaders showing the way forward, we have the absolute worst leaders. And this is not a political point. It's I judge people on what they do, not what they say. And the fact that at this kind of time of crisis, you have the President of the United States denying his own report of his own government that climate change is real. You're just at the point that inequality is rapidly rising in the UK. We're on this perverse mission to kind of extract ourselves from the EU rather than focusing on the things that are really important. So the worst possible leaders at the worst possible time is not a great combination. So how do we combat that? Well, we have to start from where we are. We're not going to kind of overthrow the current situation. It's going to require ordinary people in communities doing what they can with the resources available to them and working with other people to actually make that happen. So what gives me a lot of confidence is an organisation called Participatory City, and they've started a programme in Barking and Dagenham, which is a small area of London, and they have started a programme called Everyone Every Day. And basically it's extremely deep into the kind of the local community. They've actually they have 500 or 600 different initiatives in one local community to help people with education, to bring people together, to teach people how to make food, to help care for children, all sorts, every variety of community engagement you could possibly imagine. But it's been done in such a way that it can be copied and replicated and taken up in other communities. And that aspect of working in the open, sharing what works, making it possible to copy and replicate in your own community is a model that we fully embrace. So my society, I guess, of old is really known for its kind of tools and the data and the services that we provide. But increasingly we need to be focused on, we need to understand the systems of change that we actually operate in and the role that technology plays within it. We're a technology organisation, but we really think that technology is the most important part. Actually, it's the people that are within local communities. It's the collaborations that you allow between different organisations, and of course, it's providing the evidence and the models that can be copied and used more widely. The way we describe it is, if civic tech is to succeed over the next 10 or 15 years, it needs to be more civic and less tech. It needs to be more focused on the actual how we connect with real world situations and real people, and it can't be obsessed just about the technology, and that was obviously kind of widely covered with the previous speakers. So just very, very rapidly, I'll just give a couple of case studies and just show some of the ways that we're changing our own practice. So whatdotheyknow.com is a freedom of information service in the UK. We also run versions in 25 other countries around the world. And I think Natalie touched upon, this freedom of information, of access to information laws are giving people access to information that should be in the public domain largely. FOI is a way of kind of identifying what people are interested in and then making that information available. Of course, that process doesn't always run smoothly. So whatdotheyknow.com makes it easy for people to, in the UK, you can make an FOI request to any of 23,000 public bodies, and there's been 500,000 requests. And we operate that service in public. So the requests are in public and the responses are in public. So it means that there's an extra imperative upon government to respond in a timely manner, because everybody can see if they take longer than 20 days. So it also means that people don't or reduce the number of vexatious requests, because they're not just going to abuse the system, because that abuse would be in public as well. So it balances that out. But more importantly, thinking about how it's used with local groups. So again, in London, there's an example with Cressingham Gardens, which is a housing estate in Lambeth, was basically set up for demolition. The local community were not happy with that. And as part of a wider campaign, they actually, they've looked to expose inappropriate overspend within Lambeth Council as a whole. And Lambeth Council's famously closed. It doesn't share budget information very publicly. So they actually use freedom of information law through whatdotheyknow.com to request budget information. They made it public, and they kind of used it as part of their naming and shaming campaign. So the technology is an important enabler of that process, but it's only one small part. It's actually understanding the needs of that community and how it can fit into their campaigning activity, and then shaping the technology so it becomes a useful tool for their purposes. So again, because we work in public, so much of what we do, we're constantly having feedback about how people use our services and in real world situations, and we try and adapt and change the technology to better fit those user needs as we understand them. On the collaboration side, especially in our democracy practice, we have a dual role where we both build services, but we help convene the sector as well. So we help bring people together. They were talking about reuse of technology. One of the big barriers of reuse of services in different countries is that the data that needs to go into those services to power them is often not available. So we run democracy services in about a dozen countries, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and the UK. And one of the barriers was the fact your people just didn't know who their politicians were, especially at a local level. So we started a project, a small project, just to gather open data on every politician in the world. So that's everypolitician.org. And so far we have over 70,000 politicians from 233 countries. The way we put this together, we actually scrape from 1,100 different sources, official sources, government websites, Wikidata, a whole series of different places. We gather all this together, we reformat the data in a consistent format and a structured format, and then we release it as open data. The way we release it is we both release it as a CSV file. So if you are not a developer, you can grab the CSV and you can use it. But also we release it in a developer format, like JSON format. I'm not going to start talking about the development side of it. But we release it in a way that's useful to developers, but useful to non-expert users as well. And then what this allows is, if you want to pick up a service that uses this data and use it in your own country, you can basically switch that on with a few clicks, rather than having to kind of go through the very tedious process of kind of finding the source data. So we've set up an international version of Write to Them, which is a service we have for kind of writing to your local politicians. And basically, anyone can go and set up a version of that in their country, assuming they can tie into this data. And probably one of the most exciting things we're working on at the moment is a new initiative. Again, it's in the UK, but it's called Public Square. And this is a collaboration between the Democratic Society, and it's funded by Illuminate, who are part of the Midyar network. And this is an initiative to work with local communities and half a dozen local councils to understand how we can increase participation in democracy outside of election time. So rather than just saying, well, the only time we can get people civically engaged is when there's an election, how can we actually enable people to get involved in the myriad, the richness of life in a local community, and what role do local politicians and local government play within that? So it's really trying to understand how we can help local government, especially when they're facing really difficult funding concerns, to be part of really flourishing communities. So that's just started over the last couple of months. It's going to be a really interesting project. We did the first public event in Manchester just last week, and there'll be a lot more to come in that over the next few months. And then just finally is really the evidence side. So we run international conferences called TIC, which is the Impacts of Civic Technology Conference. Just very, very grateful to the OECD who are actually providing us with the venue in Paris in March 19th and 20th. And this is we bring together a couple of hundred practitioners, academics, researchers, to really look at the evidence base for civic technology. We're really interested in identifying what works, why does it work, and how might you use that in your own practice. So can highly recommend you consider coming to Paris in the middle of March. The call for papers is open till the end of January as well. So it is an academic conference. It's not about, here's my shiny new tool. It's about, we've done research, here are our findings, and being able to disseminate that to a wider audience. More broadly within our research practice, just last week as well, we launched our latest report, Parliaments and the People, which is looking at how digital technologies are shaping democratic information in sub-Saharan Africa. And the main reason for this is because we've been involved in this space for the last 8 or 9 years, is to learn from our experience, but also the experience of 60 or 70 different NGOs in the region, to just understand if you're going to do this type of work in these type of countries, understanding the legacy of what has come already and how you might you use that in your own work. So again, that convening aspect of around data, around evidence and so on to kind of improve our work and really recognize an active role that technology can play. So very, very briefly, secure and fair democracies need engaged and informed citizens. Your tech is really the most important part of system change, but as was mentioned already, it allows you to reach people who aren't political junkies, people who are just ordinary citizens, and do that at scale. The approach, and this is a big change for us, but you're getting over the not invented here problem. We're increasingly working with people, partners and community groups who actually represent the communities we're most trying to reach. And of course, please do join us in TIC in Paris at the OECD, March 19th and 20th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Wow. Again, a small reflection from the Estonian side, also the same thing, like people tend to think about its tech. No, this is a fundamental cultural change we are going through. And for me personally, this set of today's speakers is really relevant and important because I think the last 10 years has been a very fundamental change in actually maturing this kind of technology, because I remember my time, which was like more or less 10 years ago, and we were still considered as strange freaks from the grassroots, but now we get invited to Korea and can speak about those stuff, and now I even work for the government, so it's interesting, but also the tech has matured. But starting off with the questions and answers, and please do participate. So if you have any questions, hopefully there are some mics around as well. But I have also a few questions. Although with the first question to Helen, but it actually is to the whole panel thing. Helen mentioned the thing of politics of pain, that the current status quo is still struggling to actually understand the new technologies and the new interactions that this civic tech can basically provide, and social networks as well. The question, I like the optimism of Helen, and I also use optimism is the weapon of my choice, but the question is, I guess that all of the people in this round table have been basically banging their head against the wall at many years of their life while trying to get this idea through. Now we're already sitting behind a table here in OECD and probably other institutions as well. A lot of change has happened in 10 years. The question would be, what do you think? What's the educated guess you got that how much time do we need to making actually this cultural change happen, from the politics of pain to this appreciation of the small things, for example, that you mentioned? But this is, I think, for all. What's your guess? Can we make that happen, and what do we need to do that?
Well, I think if you're talking about time, the point is that, or the point I was trying to make is that citizens are doing it already. Most of what I was talking about was about things that are happening already. And that's where my optimism comes from. I mean, who would have thought we would have seen US school children demonstrating for gun control? You know, these kind of things, the Me Too movement and so on. Would we have seen those things without digital platforms, without social media platforms? No, we wouldn't. The problems that governments face is that they will kind of be the last, because citizens are moving ahead anyway. This is the first technology we've ever had, if you think about it. It's the first technology we've had that citizens are innovating with faster than governments. Always before, government, it's been something internal to government. Technology has been something that government develops kind of within itself and then kind of uses to interact with citizens. That's very different from what's going on now. And of course, at the same time, the platforms themselves, and you know, I was being optimistic. There has been lots of pessimism about digital platforms and social media corporations here, and rightly so, because they are moving ahead as well. You know, they're not hanging around, and all the kind of latest innovations are being progressed anyway. And I think what government has to do is kind of acknowledge that fact and actually, you know, try and play a part. There's no possibility of sort of delaying that, because this change is going to happen anyway. So there's got to be some sort of institutional catch-up. And I think I think government will have to recognise that, because the alternative is, you know, doing what some authoritarian states do, or what the UK government has talked about at various times, like, you know, close down WhatsApp, or stop access to Facebook when there's a riot and this kind of thing. And this is not viable, it's not plausible.
So anybody else has any ideas? When will the government start to adopt or change this? Like, you've been working with governments, mostly municipal, I think, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, I guess there was a comment I made earlier when we were preparing for this in relation to fixmystreet.com. So Fix My Street was originally just an antagonistic platform. It would kind of throw issues at local government and say, you need to do something about this. And actually that for the time, because it was set up 10 years ago, that was the only thing available to start that process. If you had gone to local government at the time and said, okay, there's 400 odd local councils in the UK, we're going to set up a service and actually send you emergency or non-emergency issues from citizens, they would be like, sorry, who are you and why are you talking to me? I mean, you would not even have got an audience, never mind 400 audiences you would need, because local government's very fragmented. But what that original process did, even though it was relatively antagonistic, it created the space where that discussion could happen. But in a maturing situation as we are now, I mean, civic technology, GovTech and so on, has been around for a long time now, a couple of decades at least. And that isn't good enough. If you actually want to be part of the solution, you need to work with the people responsible for dealing with the issues. I'm a huge advocate of local government. Civil servants at a local level do an incredible job with very little money and don't get much thanks for it. So how we have changed our approach to Fix My Street is that we now actively work with each local government to connect issues into their back-end service so that they can respond to the issues in the way they need to, and then report back to the citizen to say, okay, we've done this now, which increases, again, we started with trust. That increases trust that actually local government is doing a really good job and you're celebrating the good work that's done. But that needed a mind shift from us internally. The funding model is very different, so we now have a charitable side and a commercial side to be able to enable some of that. But just one quick point I'll make is that when we talk about sort of less emphasis on the tech, it's not because we think the tech has got less important, quite the reverse. It's just as any digital transformation effort matures, the people drop the digital bit. So we had digital service design in government. as people realize the benefits of that, it becomes normalized within government, and it goes, okay, let's just call it service design. And actually, there's a role for technology to play within this wider work, but the digital is not the most important part anymore. But you only get to that having gone through that initial period of disruption. So the disruption is normal, but recognizing when to kind of transition to a more collaborative effort is also really critical as well.
Natalia and Irina, you were talking about the fundamentals, I think, like first data, and Irina was like saying that, and I think I don't know what Natalia thought of that open data is just a tool, and I felt that you were kind of agreed with that statement, but still. I've been to Latin America roughly 5 times this year. For me, I felt first, I didn't know anything. I don't speak Spanish, so that's my problem. First, from looking from afar, I was thinking that, corruption is the problem in Latin America. When I went there, I discovered that it's not. Problem is that people have accepted that. So, and I think that open data and all of the stuff that you are doing that's one of the main things that you are like tackling, main issues. How's that going? Are you making any success in actually changing the political culture as well?
Okay, so please just let me add something on the prior question. As I said, I used to be a public official for 10 years. And when we think about this cultural change about collaboration between government and civil society, we need to also think about changing the curriculum of what public officials actually learn. Because when you get into government, you are taught how to be a public official, and government doesn't tend to move as fast as technology does. So one of the major collaborations that we did in Argentina was actually co-create a new curriculum for the incoming public officials that actually addressed open government, public innovation, what a hackathon is, so they wouldn't panic, and things like that. So that's very important also. We need to think about having the proper persons to interact. Now that I work outside of government, I have to look for the proper person in order for them not to panic. Because it's okay, so we're going to open up data and we're going to work 48 hours in a row, and they panic. Just of that question. And then coming back to the Open Data Charter, our 2018 strategy is based on this quote, public with a purpose. So it's not just about opening up data and that's it. And Irina made this point very clear. We need to first focus on what we want to solve and then think about which data is critical in order to open and in order to collaborate and actually create a public policy that addresses that problem. We've gone through the phase of open and they will come. So governments tended to open up any data and say that they were doing open data policy. But then civil society actually created the term open washing, which means governments say they are open, but they are actually playing the part and not opening up critical data. So we're now evolving, slowly, but evolving into a more publish with a purpose strategy all throughout the open data community. As far as Latin America, you're right into your, as this is a personal point of view, me being Argentinian. We are used to corruption in Latin America, but a couple of cases came up in the last 2 years that actually showed a massive system that crossed the limits of the states and actually were working in like these corruption systems were working in several countries at the same time. And that investigation, Odebrecht it's called, actually took down 2 presidents. So I think we were accustomed to it, but we're fed up. And then the Organization of American States actually released a statement this year that was signed by all the presidents and heads of state of the region, creating an open data program, hemispheric program on open data to combat anti-corruption. So, and it has a very big component of participation and civic engagement, because governments themselves are not going to solve this. So we are used to, but we're moving forward we moved into being angry, and now we're doing something about it. This program is going to start next year, so in the next forum I will tell you how we go, but now we are.
So, Irina, what do you have any ideas? How can you re-decentralize everything?
How can we re-decentralize all things? So I'm just going to let my subconscious process that question while I talk about some of the other points that people have made, and then it will just magically come up with this wonderful pithy answer. So I just really quickly want to touch on a couple of points that Natalie made, which is around literacy of politicians and, I think also civil servants. I think there's a huge importance around increasing the kind of digital literacy especially, but also open literacy of the people who are actually kind of representing us, acting on our behalf, figuring out what to do with all the shared resources that they get through our taxation. And I think that's absolutely critical. We increasingly live in a world where transparency is really important, accountability is really important, digital is really important, and to misunderstand the ability for that to kind of shape society is a major problem. I think the other thing that I want to say is there's something about giving people an experience of empowerment and kind of connecting back, creating sort of feedback loops. Yes, you're right that some people have sort of given up and they've lost hope, but I think things kind of can shift quite quickly, but sometimes they take many years. If you look at the kind of climate change movement, people have been talking about this for a really long time and have been researching and writing about it for a really long time. And it's only kind of recently where it feels like there's some kind of tipping point has happened and people are starting to really say, no, enough is enough. And it's not okay anymore. And we need, there has to be leadership about this. And this is coming from all corners in a way that's actually really inspiring. And I think there's, we need to kind of give people ways in which they can participate and advocate, and that has some kind of meaningful impact, and that doesn't just disappear into a void. And I think decentralization is part of that. So the thing with kind of re-decentralizing all the things is, you kind of move away from a top-down hierarchy into more of a flat hierarchy, into sort of networks of people. You kind of create opportunities for there to be communities that are connected to each other directly, not through a single source of power, who can push for things that are important to them. Part of the issue of centralization is, if you kind of go beyond the fact that the kind of digital monopolies of today have more money than most nation states, and there's just a general issue. There's also a problem with resilience, which is everything is going through, all the information, all the kind of decision making, all the control goes through a central point, and that is not very empowering for everyone who's not that central point. If you think about a small diagram, you've got a bicycle wheel, the hub and spoke model. The various little kind of bits around the center are just obviously much less powerful than the kind of hub in the middle, which kind of connects everybody else, which knows all the things. Whilst if you have a network where all the different nodes are connected to each other, there's a different experience about the change you're able to have, which is a different kind of change, but I think creates new models of how we can communicate and talk to each other. And also potentially could be really exciting for given that we have devices, some of us have two. I've got like my laptop and my phone in front of me. These things could be talking to each other and could be storing stuff and computing things in a way that absolutely can work without Wi-Fi, can work underground, can work in different ways. Like we could be using decentralization to solve problems without a reliance on some kind of either crypto overlord or techno overlord or any other overlord.
So about networks and empowerment, questions. So you raised a hand there. Yes, and your next one. So.
Hello, my name is Rita. I work in open data in Hong Kong. And I have a question to all of you actually about that how do we move beyond open data? Because many of the grand challenges that we are discussing here also include big data, sensor data, so the whole data-fied society that can give us good insights. And I think that a lot of the NGOs are still too much focused on open data per se, and it needs to move much faster beyond that. And so, I mean, Irina, you touched on this a little bit. Basically, open data has been a failure in most countries, and there's very few countries where it really works. So how do we move to the next step to broaden it to general data approach and access for civic engagement? Thanks.
So let's take the second question as well. Then we can probably, because maybe they're linked. Let's see. Beyond open data.
Not at all linked. Sorry, Martin.
Oh.
Thanks. First of all, thanks everyone for a really, really rich and stimulating debate. I'm struggling to form my views, which is normally a sign that we don't talk about this often enough. Or maybe, Andy, I just don't get invited to the meetings. I'm the UK rep at the OECD, so I represent the UK government. So I'm not going to respond on some of the points that have been made about the UK specifically, but should probably say that silence does not constitute assent. Just a couple of questions. First of all, probably to Helen. About 20 years ago, we had a debate around the effect of the rolling news, the emergence of rolling news on government policy and decision making, where, moving away from the sort of daily newspapers setting the agenda, we were in a situation where politicians had to respond pretty much continuously as the agenda changed and was set. And at the time, people were saying, well, this was a bad thing because it meant that governments were taking decisions in a rush. Maybe the agenda was being skewed too quickly. If we're now in a world of social media setting the agenda with sort of increased instantaneous force, do you think any of those risks that we were talking about 20 years ago might apply here? That, government is under pressure from multiple directions to take decisions on sometimes, issues that have emerged out of nowhere, and that might lower the quality of decision making? That's one question. And then the second question, which is riffing on something that Irina was talking about, I completely see that activism is easier in the digital world, and that increasing numbers of people can mobilize behind issues. I wonder, and I really don't want this to come across as a patronizing question, but I'll say it anyway, whether the lower transaction costs of engaging mean that maybe sometimes decisions or support can be lent a bit lightly. If 50 years ago to get involved in the political process you had to go to the effort of going to a local political party, sitting through a meeting, sitting through a 4-hour meeting, standing up and saying your view and being challenged there and then, maybe you invested a little bit more in the political process. Is there any risk that people are maybe not investing quite as much in the political process? Thanks.
So, beyond open data, and Helen and Irina?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try and respond to both questions, actually. I mean, yes, to your point, does it put pressure on governments? Totally. I mean, the whole digital environment, as it is today, puts pressure on governments to innovate, to be more responsive, to take account perhaps more of what citizens think, and to use data, which governments have traditionally, all governments have traditionally been very bad at using sort of real-time transactional data. They're not used to having it available. And I think there is a lot of catch-up to be done. So yes, it does put pressure on governments, but I don't think there's anything we can do about that. It's not going to. I think there has been the governmental culture, perhaps understandably enough, does very much sort of lend itself to the let's wait till it all settles down and then but it's not going to settle down really. So alternatively, the response has to be to sort of, I would argue, kind of re-institutionalize, to borrow your kind of re-eyes something, a sort of institutional catch-up in terms of learning to kind of adjust to it and not always be on the run, but be learning how to sort of relate to this, to this environment, which is different, but not completely impossible to deal with, I think. It's not surprising. Social media have been intertwined with our political systems for such a short amount of time, really. It's only been, a few years, really, less than 10 years. It's not surprising that there's institutional catch-up to do, but I think it has got to be done. And just to relate that to your point about the data, I mean, that is so true, I believe, and it's particularly true with respect to the digital platforms themselves. I'm a social scientist. I'm tremendously excited by the opportunities that new forms of data provide. We've never had data like this before. We've been reliant I've been reliant as a social scientist on, survey data about what people think they did or think they might do, not transactional data. But it's very tempting at the time when there's data everywhere. It's a bit like, it's a bit like the ancient Maria in the middle of the sea without any fresh drinking water. There's data everywhere, but you can't get hold of any because it's all locked up in proprietary platforms. And the situation there's got worse rather than better. There's far too much scholarly research attention on Twitter because that's the only place that people can get any data. And I think we have got to work, coming back to the institutional point, got to learn to work, we've got to put pressure on corporations to release data for research and for policy making. As well. We've got to be able to somehow sort of make those barriers a little more porous, not in a kind of privacy-threatening kind of way, as per Cambridge Analytica, but in a privacy-preserving sort of way. And there are ways to do that, and I think that should be a priority. Yeah, I better stop.
So let's do short ones.
I'll be really quick.
Sorry.
And then Natty could or others. So I think on the open data front, like one thing I do want to say is I think there's a huge amount of value in the kind of cultural and social expectation that open is better, and actually we should be working in the open. I mean, I think GDS famously likes make things open, it makes things better. I absolutely agree with that, and what Mark talked about working. But when it comes to is open data having the impact, I think part of the issue is are we asking the right questions? Are we defining the problem? There's a lot of sort of, hey, let's just do things, but actually we need to be talking to communities and understanding what the issues are, doing user research, kind of creating those kind of feedback loops and testing what works, like testing, iterating, experimenting. I believe that the future of open data is around specific sort of vertical sectors. How do we make education, healthcare, more effective, and how do we use data? I personally would say that the future trends are around things like that could be called data commons or data trusts. Why is a lot of the data that is incredibly valuable locked up in proprietary companies? Mapping data. Google has a huge amount of data around locations that compete with what governments are able to produce to some extent. To what extent should some of this data be actually civically or government-owned and then leased and kind of allowed to be used by companies to drive innovation and provide services, versus is actually produced by companies who have enough money to produce it. So that would be kind of my bet around that area. In terms of sort of participation petitions, yeah, definitely. I think, and again, there's a balance here. I think things like the Me Too movement have been very incredibly effective, but also there is this there's an issue about how do you engage in a meaningful way, and I think that connects back to, well, what are the feedback loops? Like, how do we, it's like a signal versus noise issue as well. There's just so much. Everyone's kind of, so many people. There's so much you can do, and it's so easy to kind of just retweet and feel like you're doing something. But I also think that people are increasingly aware that it leaves them kind of empty. One of the charities that I'm currently advising is looking at how do we do something about refugees. So, for example, they have started trying to scale up a way to have meals with refugees kind of in community. So if you want to do something about refugees, you kind of try and cook and eat together. And I think those kind of things are starting to spring up where there's like a different call to action that I hope will increase kind of civic participation.
So we're really running into the lunch. So Mark, final words beyond open data.
I'm going to make 10 seconds. The first point on open data, the question, it's not connected into the things people want access to in open data. The open data that's been released and why it's failed, it's just the open data that is easy for governments to actually release and they happen to have around, rather than these are the things as citizens we want to have as open data. So we try and get around that by connecting it using freedom of information requests to identify what data should be open. Second thing is on MHCLG, Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. They are getting around this problem. I've been overwhelmed with all of this by a real back to basics approach. So they've got a program called Fix the Plumbing. So it's not about blockchain, it's not about AI or any of that other nonsense. It's about let's get the basics right within local government first so that we can then do the bigger stuff. Because if you try and do the big stuff now, it is nonsense. If you get the basics right, then you can actually have a proper involvement. They're doing it all in the open. They're listening, co-creating with the people they're actually serving. That's how you get around the kind of the influx of all this information.
And as you want a short word as well? Okay, Natalia, beyond open data.
Just a note, and that's it. Pointing out on building up on what Helen said, the GovLab based in NYU is actually working on a framework called Data Collaboratives, which developed 6 models on how governments and private sector can actually share data in order to create public value, which is a very interesting framework to take a look at. And then for the UK representative, there's this book about that Micah Seyfried wrote, which is called How Internet Didn't Change Anything, which would be interesting for you to read. He wrote that book in answering another book that is called Here Comes Everybody, which was a positive vision on how internet was changing things, and then he wrote this, and the interaction between the two authors is interesting, and I could speak about this afterwards. Thanks.
So, thank you everybody. We will head off to lunch. A small reflection from the Estonian side. As Mark mentioned, we actually need to work on the plumbing. There is a lots of basics that we don't know. Open data, yes, is just a tool, but still this is part of the plumbing. Let's work on the plumbing and then go into the more of the fancy stuff, probably. So thank you everybody for listening. Hopefully there was some food for thought. Let's head off for lunch. Thank you.
This